Thank you. I'm squeaking. I do have one disclaimer. I have not had a near-death experience, but I am married to one, Lee Lawrence. His friends told him he needed a psychiatrist, and so he found me. The title of my talk, Diving into Increasing Depths, comes from Rilke's poems, A Book for the Hour of Prayer, 8 a.m. You have not grown old, and it's not too late to dive into your increasing depths, where life calmly gives out its own secret. There's 4 questions I wanted to address in this talk. What are the ethical guidelines for spirituality in clinical practice? And what do you ask when you're talking to people about their spirituality? What blocks people from these experiences? And how do we harvest symbols of the spiritual experiences? Now, the largest accreditation association for hospitals in America, the Joint Commission of Accreditation of Hospital Organizations, has actually made it a mandate to include questions of spirituality when people are hospitalized for psychiatric illnesses, specifically to ask about their beliefs, values, and preferences. Also, with other appointments, to have a learning needs assessment, which includes cultural and religious beliefs. But we're not including this only because it's mandated, but because it's also good for our health. After September 11th, about 90% of people sought comfort through spirituality and their religions. And the National Center for PTSD put out a list of ways to take spiritual care of yourself through that crisis. There's also been a lot of research showing that meditation is good for your health, and so it's been endorsed by the American Heart Association, the National Institute of Health, and Andrew Weil's 8 Weeks to Optimal Health. It's also already integrated into psychiatry with Marsha Lanahan's dialectical behavior therapy. There, in the skills group, mindfulness meditation is included in every group session. And that's because she was largely influenced by a Zen teacher. The 12-step programs are also endorsed by the APA. The AA's 11th step is prayer and meditation. And there's aspects of spiritual practices that are included in pain management and stress management. So I'm going to do a quick poll here. How many nurses are in the audience today? How many of them are hospice workers or palliative care nurses? Massage therapists or energy workers? Social workers? Psychologists? And medical doctors? And psychiatrists? I prefer instead of being a shrink, I'd rather be an expander, opening hearts and expanding minds. So I went through all the codes of ethics for these organizations, and always there's a sense of compassion and respect for the dignity and worth of the human being. That's true with the Nurses Code, the Palliative Nurses Association, and the massage therapists, recognizing the individuality and not discriminating. The social workers added several things to this. It includes that not only respect for cultural diversity, but also promoting self-determination, that people are the leaders of their own life in terms of choices that they're making, and they're empowered to address their own needs. They also added cultural competence, which is the idea that the social workers should also understand and seek to educate themselves about different religions and the oppression people might have faced with them. In their work-related activities, psychologists respect the rights of others to hold values, attitudes, and opinions that differ from their own. They also have an ethics principle for rights and dignity, to be aware and respect cultural and individual role differences, including, and there's a very long list, religion. The AMA has an ethics principle for compassion and respect for human dignity and rights. But it's the American Psychiatric Association that has actually published guidelines for working with religious and spiritual commitments and psychiatric practice. They first published one in 1989, and it was these first two items of respect and not imposing. And what's interesting about this is not only its respect for values, beliefs, and worldviews, but also not imposing your own views, whether they be religious, spiritual, anti-religious, or other, such as political views. They specifically gave an example that if someone comes for help and says they're depressed, and your particular clinic has a political association, and you say you're not depressed, you're oppressed, you have to participate in these protests and you'll feel better, that is not the standard of care if they're coming to a mental health professional. Then in the 2006 document, they added that treatment decisions should be made with the patient taking into consideration religious and spiritual ideals. An example of that is if someone's very devout and a psychiatrist is giving all kinds of interpretations that might be disrespectful, that might be very hurtful, and in one case led to a suicide because the person was so invalidating of where that person's strength was coming from. So, how do we take a spiritual history? Well, I called my colleague Harold Koenig, who has many books out on this subject, and he gave me the one that's used at the Duke Center for Theology, Religion, and Health. It's also, you can find it in the Journal of the American Medical Association article that he also wrote. The first question is, do your religious or spiritual beliefs provide comfort, or are they a source of stress? That's an interesting addition. They've done research, I'll give the source of that later, of saying that there's some, if there's a lot of stressful aspects to religion, that can be increased, correlated with anxiety and depression and bad health outcomes for cardiac disease. Do you have spiritual beliefs that might influence your medical decisions? Are you a member of a religious or spiritual community, and is it supportive to you? And do you have any other spiritual needs that you'd like someone to address? Which begs the question, when should you refer to clergy? And here's the citing for the Archives of Internal Medicine 2001, which shows that religious struggles, if people are struggling with excessive guilt or feeling like this illness is a punishment of God, these things may actually increase mortality and should be addressed. In our hospital, we would call for a chaplain. Another times that it's important for a consult is maybe if people are refusing a treatment based on religious grounds. And a beautiful story about this is in Rachel Naomi Remen's book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. And it's called The Rabbi's Rabbi. And basically, the rabbi had a daughter who was sick with lymphoma, and she needed these regular treatments for that, but it fell on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, when you shouldn't touch, and he was Orthodox, and you shouldn't touch leather, and you shouldn't ride cars, and you shouldn't handle money. And he said she can't come on that day. And Dr. Remen, who is a pediatric oncologist, she's also a patient with her own Crohn's disease, she was just horrified, and they said, how can you do that? And he quoted back to her Abraham and Isaac, that God's will is above the rule of man or health. And she's like, can you get a second opinion on that? And so he said, okay, I will call my teacher, who is a rabbi's rabbi, and I will write to him about this dilemma. And as soon as the rabbi, the teacher, got the answer, got the letter, he called him immediately and said, you must go. You must go, and not only does your daughter need to go to the treatment, but her father, who's the holiest man that she knows at this time in her life, must accompany her. So they showed up in the waiting room. The rabbi said, you may ride in a taxi on the holiest of days for the purpose of preserving life. And he said that he needed to go with her because she would feel if she's breaking the law and he's not, that could affect her health. Another time to give a referral to clergy is religious education. I'm not really there to discuss theology with people. I happen to know that every religion has some sense of an afterlife, although they differ on whether there's reincarnation. One of my patients comes in and he always wears black. He's been very obsessed with death since he was in the Korean War. And he has a recurrent dream of coffins. And I ask him, well, what do you think happens after death? And he says to me, well, nothing, it's just the worms. And I was like, really? I'm like, what religion are you? And, he said he was Baptist. And I was like, do you go to a church? Do you have a pastor you could talk to? And he said, sure, I could talk to my pastor. I was like, well, why don't you go and ask him these questions? Ask him if there's anything in Christianity about an afterlife. And the reason I referred him to get that education is because it put him back with his community, with someone he could talk to and develop himself spiritually. I don't want someone to depend on me for that, although I'm there to assist. But he heard it from his minister's mouth himself, and it made a huge change in his life, in how he was looking at life and death and the people that had passed before him. Spirituality groups. At the Durham VA Hospital, we have been including the chaplains to offer groups to the veterans. We have a group with the PTSD veterans in the Raleigh Vet Center because we know that there's a problem. The chaplain gives a talk called Healing Fractured Faith After War, that there's a lot of that trauma that sometimes shakes people's spiritual and religious roots. And there's other issues about rebuilding spirituality after those experiences. It's included in the substance abuse program, and it's included in our mental health clinic. There are some people, when you ask the learning assessments, they say, I don't believe in God, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want it included in my treatment. And they should know that there's rational recovery, which is parallel to an AA group, but they don't have the spiritual component if that's the direction they want to go. So to take that into consideration. There's times when you might also want a cultural faith worker. When I was working at the state hospital, a patient came in convinced that he had a root. I had no idea what he was talking about because I had spent 8 years in Chicago, and this was my introduction to North Carolina. And so I needed a little cultural education from my social worker, who said, well, we've got roots down here. People put curses on them, and they're not going to believe that that's going to be removed unless you call in a root worker. And so, it was not instead of getting treatment, but included in the treatment, to have someone talk to them and do something that would tell them that the root was gone, so that they could feel better with that. Another spiritual assessment, which was in the American Family Physician in 2001, is a lot easier to remember if you like mnemonics, because it's HOPE, H-O-P-E. What sources of hope, meaning, comfort, strength, peace, love, and compassion do you have in your life? If you're asked that question, you might include your near-death experience. I had a patient come in and she said, oh gosh, I've had 3 people die this month. And I said, wow, how do you feel about death? What are your thoughts about that? And she said, oh, I'm not afraid. I said, really? And she said, no, I've had 2 near-death experiences, so I'm not afraid. And I believed her. Are you part of an organized religion or community? The organized religion is more the institution, the traditions, the gathering of the people, whereas P is the personal spiritual spirituality and what practices you use. And then E is what effects have spirituality on your medical care and any of the end-of-life decisions. This is a poem called Yellow from her book Evidence by Mary Oliver. This is not evidence-based medicine, this is evidence-based poetry. There is a heaven we enter through institutional grace. That's religion. And there are the yellow finches bathing and singing in the lowly puddle. Another questionnaire that came out was on FICA, but the questions are similar. And they're constantly coming up with new questionnaires and actually scales to do research, not only for the clinical assessment, but research scales. And this one included some of the positive coping and some of the negative coping. I'm not going to give you all of these, but just to show there's a lot of spirituality scales, because there is research being done on spirituality in medicine and psychotherapy. And these are a book that came out just this year in paperback, Spiritually Integrated Therapy. So we have this way of talking. We have our logical mind and the questions and answers and filling out forms and filling out scales. We have this way of talking, and we have another. Apart from what we wish or fear may happen, we are alive with other life, as clear stones take form in the mountain. So to do an informal assessment, without the computer in front of you, without a form to fill out, is just to stop and not be distracted and be present to the person in front of you. To look at them and look in their eyes and look what energy or feeling you get just being with them, and listen to what they have to say. The most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen. Just listen. Perhaps the most important thing we give each other is attention. A loving silence often has more power to heal and connect than the most well-intentioned words. Dr. Remen again. So let's listen to a near-death experience narrative. I forgot to mention this, I'm also president of the Jung Society of the Triangle. And in Carl Jung, who is a Swiss psychoanalyst who coined the term synchronicity, extroversion, introversion, archetypes, and psychology of the complexes, in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he recalls that he had a near-death experience in 1944. Now, actually, he's very generous with his description. It goes on for 6 pages, so I'm going to just give you an abridged description, but part of it, I'd like you to hear his words. He had a heart attack, and he was sort of in an unconscious state. And when he woke up, his nurse told him that it was as if you were surrounded by a bright glow. And even in 1945, that was a phenomenon that the nurse had noticed with other people who were dying. I had reached the outermost limit and did not know whether I was in a dream or in ecstasy. At any rate, strange things began to happen to me. It seemed that I was way up high in space, and he describes with excruciating detail, as only he can do, that he was not just high above in the room looking down at things, he was way out looking at the whole globe and seeing the seas, the Mediterranean, and then seeing the deserts. So there was this bright blue, and then there was a bright yellow of the deserts, and then he was getting close to the white of the snow-capped Himalayas. And he comes to a temple, and there is a Hindu priest there, and he's about to enter the temple. But a strange thing happened. I had the feeling that everything was being sloughed away. Everything I aimed at or wished for or had thought, the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence, fell away or was stripped from me. An extremely painful process. Nevertheless, something remained. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, everything that had happened around me. And he says to himself, this is what I am. I am this bundle of what has been and what has been accomplished. If you're going to say anything to someone's spiritual near-death experience, ask them how they feel. He goes on to say, the experience gave me a feeling of extreme poverty, but at the same time, a great fullness. There was no longer anything I wanted or desired. I existed in an objective form. I was what I had been lived. At first, the sense of alienation predominated, of having been stripped or pillaged, but suddenly that became of no consequence, a fait accompli, without any reference back to what had been. There was no longer any regret. On the contrary, I had everything that I was, and that was everything. Then in the middle of this experience, he sees his doctor, and he gets the message, you must return. And quickly, the moment I heard that, it ceased. I was profoundly disappointed, for now it seemed to have been for nothing. The painful process of defoliation had been in vain, and I was not allowed to enter the temple, to join the people in whose company I belonged. And then what happened afterwards? Well, it took him 3 weeks to recover from this. He didn't feel like eating. Everything seemed to repel him. He felt disappointed that he had to be in a box again. So maybe there was a sense of that altered geometry. And then he had a premonition. We talk about, there's other lectures this weekend about what are the after effects afterwards. And he had a premonition that his doctor was going to die. And in fact, he was the doctor's last patient. The doctor came to visit him, and then he went home and never woke up. And that was April 4th, 44. He continued to have a sense of light around things, as if everything was enchanted, and had 3 visions at this time, as if the person bringing him food was serving him in a garden of pomegranates. He also had a vision of a marriage of the Lamb and the marriage of Zeus and Hera as described in the Iliad. That's pretty typically Jung. The inner states were so fantastically beautiful that by comparison this world appeared downright ridiculous. As I approached closer to life again, they grew fainter, and scarcely 3 weeks after the first vision, they ceased altogether. It is impossible to convey the beauty and the intensity of emotion during this experience. They were the most tremendous things I had ever experienced, and what a contrast that day was. I was tormented and on edge. Everything irritated me. Everything was too material, too crude and clumsy, terribly limited both spatially and spiritually. He also had this scent that he smelled, which has sometimes been called the odor of sanctity or the sweet smell of the Holy Ghost. And he had a shift in his sense of time. We shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which present, past, and future are one. And the only thing that feeling could grasp would be a sum, an iridescent whole. So just listen and allow that to sink in. And we listen non-judgmentally. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing or right-doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. So if you are going to ask a question, ask about the effects and the affects. How did this affect you in your life from then on? And affects about what were your feelings about this? In 1961, the BBC was interviewing Jung. Has anyone seen this video? It's kind of dramatic because there's a thunderstorm in the distance, and the lights shake and the room shakes, and and he asked him this question: so, do you believe in God? And Jung says, I would not say I believe. I know. I have had the experience of being gripped by something stronger than myself that people call God. So what blocks people from their spirituality? As a psychiatrist, we always think the key is in childhood being replayed in adulthood. We call this transference. Some of your experience or relationship get transferred onto someone else. And so it's fair, being respectful, to include that in the spiritual realm as you would in how they handle money or how they're handling their relationships or why they're getting along at work. So I asked someone about his spiritual experience, and he's like, oh, I believe there's a God, but he doesn't have any time for me. And I was like, he doesn't have any time for you? Yeah, I'm always amazed what people say. And I said, what do you mean? And, he's busy. There's so many people in the world. And so I said, this might be a leap, but you've never told me about your father. And he's like, well, he played golf all the time, and he had his business, and he didn't have any time for me. And I was like, well, do you think there's any connection with what you experienced with your father and how you're looking at God the Father? And so people could start making those connections so that they could start to maybe think broader. There can also be traumas that shattered faith and make people feel like the world or God is not to be trusted, that you're alone in a very painful world. And that takes a lot more rebuilding. And we have to be aware that there's a lot of negative religious experiences, from abuse to cults to just excessive guilt from a very strict, punitive view of God that people might have had as a child. The therapist or health professional needs to also be aware of their own countertransference pitfalls. The pitfalls, you need to be aware of them so you don't fall into the pits. And it can happen either way. If you're a very religious person, you might grab a hold of everything and want to talk about it all the time and overlook some symptoms of something more serious going on. Also, don't assume that you know what the terms are that people are using. Someone said I had a near-death experience, and I said, tell me about it. And he's like, well, someone was shot right next to me. And I said, and then what happened? He's like, well, he died, but I lived. This was not a shared death experience. This was a close call. So, you have to check out your terminology. There's also, if someone has a similar interest, you might end up talking theology and not actually getting to the work or the reason why they're there. The non-religious person might say, oh, you're speaking in tongues. How about some Thorazine? Or ignore religion as something unimportant or something you need to be rescued from your illusions. They might overinterpret things and say, oh, you're not a believer anymore. Well, that's progress. So you have to be careful. There's interpersonal fears of the individual that can also affect how people look at things. I'm going to focus on the fear of submission. Like someone comes in and says, I'm angry and I'm allowed to be angry and you can't take that away from me and you can't tell me what to do. And I went to talk to him because he didn't want to give up anger at all. And I said, well, has anyone helped you while you were here? well, if you have a fear of submission, nobody's going to help you. He said no one's help, not the medical student, not the nurse, not the social worker, not the resident, not the attending doctor. So it's like, I said, nobody? And he said, oh, the chaplain did. I was like, oh, well, what did the chaplain have to say to you? And he said, you know what he did? He went through the Bible, starting at the Old Testament, and he showed me how God got angry and then had to curb his anger. You know, if God has a big flood and wants to destroy everything, he said, maybe I shouldn't be that destructive. And I'll make you a promise. I'm not going to be that destructive. I'm going to put a rainbow in the sky. And it's like, well, you know, if God had to curb his anger, maybe I should too. When you're talking with people about spirituality, you might not get the whole story, because we're all afraid about being hurt with things that are close to our hearts. You know, if I share a story that was an answer to a prayer, are you going to say I'm crazy and having magical thinking? Are you going to ridicule that or reduce it to coincidence or just having misunderstood? These kinds of interactions are painful, and so a lot of times people won't tell you. And so if you do ask about spirituality, it shows at least that you're interested. And as they go further, they might tell you some more. It's the old rule that drunks have to argue and get into fights. The lover is just as bad. He falls into a hole. But down in that hole, he finds something shining, worth more than any amount of money or power. Last night, the moon came dropping its clothes in the street. I took it as a sign to start singing, falling up into the bowl of sky. The bowl breaks. Everywhere is falling everywhere. Nothing else to do. Here's the new rule. Break the wine glass. Fall toward the glass blower's breath. So we have experiences that bring us closer to the divine, to the glass blower's breath, to the source, to the eternal life. Near-death experiences are one of them. There's others that you can also have in this lifetime, experiences during prayer or meditation, synchronicity, and I'll just say quickly about synchronicity. Jung coined that term, and one of the stories he tells in his collective works book on synchronicity is that there was a patient who was very rational, and she couldn't be swayed from her Cartesian thinking, and she had a dream. It was weeks. He would hear her, go through rhetoric about things, and she had a dream that someone had given her a golden scarab, a piece of jewelry of incredible worth, and she was just kind of minimizing that and taking it as nothing special, and kind of going on to other things that were more important. And he heard a scratching at the door, at the window, and he opened it up, and there was a golden beetle. And he went over and handed it to her and said, "Here's your golden scarab. Now let's pay some attention to that dream again." I found this poem, A Bee, it's a haiku that I thought was important for this conference. A bee staggers out of the peony. This is from the Zen master Basho. And I thought about that bee being like her experiencers, or having one of these experiences, of being so enveloped with all these petals of a peony and all the lushness, and having you're full of nectar that you stagger out somewhat drunk. And a bee staggers out of the peony. The next section is on how to harvest spiritual symbols. Religions are a good container for many very powerful symbols, And that's partly what gives them life if we learn to interact with them even from our own traditions or from others. Jung said an idea is a coin, a symbol is life. I wanted to give some examples of amplifying personal symbols, and I thought I'd give one from when my dad was dying. He had end-stage stomach cancer, and one of the things he said to me in the middle of all of this was, "Theresa, do you remember how to prepare the asparagus?" And I thought about this. My dad loved to cook, and asparagus is not something you have to measure or see where the dead part is or the live part is or anything. You just find the natural break, and you feel it, and the ends come off where they should. And he had an advanced directive, which I prefer to call allowed natural death. And in this, he showed me how to live and how to die, as simply as breaking an asparagus. Let's see, am I on time? Okay. I forget what the time frame is. Pardon? Our time people aren't here, so I don't want to say more than 18 minutes. Okay, then we do have time for some other stories. So when you're talking to someone and mainly listening to them, I'm listening for symbols that might be very powerful then. And sometimes, just like the scarab, people will sort of minimize or overlook them or not really value them. And in Rachel Remen's book, there's a story called Style, and they're trying to do some visualization to help the chemotherapy, and a lot of the people are choosing sharks. And this guy comes in and mumbles, "Well, my image wasn't vicious enough to kill the cancer." And she's like, "Well, what symbol came up for you during this meditation?" And he was embarrassed, and he said, "A catfish." But she had him speak more about catfish. It's not aggressive and it's not competitive. They are the bottom feeders that sift through the sand with their gills, eating what no longer supports the life in an aquarium. And they never sleep. They're able to make rapid and accurate decisions, just like an air traffic controller. And this man had actually had a catfish that was a pet of his. So she talked to him about the immune system. And he had not known that the DNA of each of our billions of cells carries a highly individual signature, a sort of personal designer logo. And so you can learn, the immune system learns to recognize what needs to be found on the cellular level, patrolling what's self and what's not self. And the cancer cells had lost their DNA. The healthy immune system attacks them and destroys them. In fact, his unconscious mind, very wisely, had chosen a very accurate metaphor for the immune system and what it had done. And this is why it's important to listen and stay out of the way, become something more wonderful or more profound will emerge. So, another poem. So you can get these metaphors or images or symbols from dreams, from interactions with people, and from maybe just walking out in nature or going to an art museum to see what calls to your soul. From Mary Oliver, The Snowy Egret. A late summer night, and the snowy egret has come again to the shallows in front of my house, as he has for 40 years. Don't think he is a casual part of my life, that white stroke in the dark. Don't take your symbols casually. your imagination, your capacity to make these images is very abiding and available. So in summary, we've learned that the ethical values in health profession, the ethical values should guide speaking about spirituality in clinical practice. Respect, dignity and worth, cultural competence, self-determination, which is the opposite of imposition or setting agendas for other people, and meaningful consideration of the spiritual issues in the treatment plan. What do you ask for a spiritual history? Well, you can make a formal assessment like hope, what brings hope, meaning, comfort, strength to your life, organized religion, personal spiritual practices, and the effects on your treatment planning. Or you can just be present and take time to listen. What blocks people from spirituality? The transference from their childhood, maybe the counter-transference from their provider, and fear. Mostly fear from invalidation or fear from losing control. And this is mostly an invitation to have that conversation, to listen, to remove what blocks might be there, and to harvest the symbols of spiritual experience. Hafiz, from the book I Heard God Laughing, a poet is someone who can pour light into a spoon, then raise it to nourish your beautiful, parched, holy mouth. And your imagination, your symbol-making capacity, is a part of yourself that can pour that light into a spoon and raise it to nourish your beautiful, parched, holy mouth, and maybe that of the world. So back to Rilke. You see, I want a lot. Perhaps I want everything. The darkness that comes with every infinite fall, and the shivering blaze of every step up. So many live on and want nothing, and are raised to the rank of prince by their slippery ease of their light judgments. But what you love to see are faces that do work and do thirst. You love most of all those who need you as they need a crowbar or a hoe. You have not grown old, and it is not too late to dive into your increasing depths where life calmly gives out its own secret. So take the plunge. We have 10 minutes left for questions.
I didn't understand exactly. Were you saying that if you're dealing with someone and their religious belief is causing stress, that's bad? If it's not causing stress, that's good?
They can cause stress because there can be different soul searching that's going on. So I wouldn't quantify that positively and negatively. But there can be some negative thoughts like this illness is caused by God as a punishment for something I did that do add stress that might need to be challenged.
But isn't that imposing your own spiritual viewpoint then on somebody that believes that God does punish people?
There's ways we try to open people's hearts, and it's not an imposition. It's trying to be sort of a midwife to their spirituality. So I don't necessarily say...
I think I understand exactly, but it's a very, very thin line. It takes a lot of skill to navigate that line. Because I would say that in my reading of some of the, actually there's books like Spiritual Emergencies, etc. But in reading a lot of stuff, a lot of the most profound spiritual experiences came from people that were stressed out from that.
So maybe understanding the stress that they're under.
Yeah, if I'm in a position where I'm torturing my children and therefore I think that's a sin that's causing me a lot of stress, then maybe that's a good thing.
Right.
But I'm still tortured.
There are some values in terms of not harming others, both in our medical profession to do no harm, but also that if someone is really harming someone or harming themselves, that needs to be challenged.
I think the most difficult thing is that helping people in a clinical kind of ways, this kind of a box, and spirituality is this other and bigger kind of box, and making sure that you're honoring both kinds of boxes, I think, is difficult. So I congratulate you because it's a really difficult thing to do. Thanks.
Well, sometimes that's when to get a referral. Maybe I don't need to explain it to someone. Maybe their minister can help them with that struggle. And sometimes if you're comfortable with things, if someone's bringing in something that says, well, I'm not allowed to get angry, and says, well...
That's a quick question about that. If the minister is telling them X and you believe Y, then what do you do?
We still believe in self-determination and trying to help the patient or the person sort that through.
I think there's a great danger in equating spirituality with organized religion too closely, because I find oftentimes that the organized religion is very divisive and restrictive, and that I think the point of spirituality is to open our knowledge, open ourselves up to growth spiritually and in other ways. And what's your feelings about my statement? Do you find that to be true, or?
There are paths for spiritual growth within the organized traditions, and maybe people need to get in line with that. But in the studies, they're separating religion from the organized tradition, institutional rituals, worship, community, from the individual practices. And there can be, just like you beautifully said, more heart-opening individually. And sometimes people need time alone with that before they can reintegrate that into their community.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, it's really refreshing to, and being a Jungian background, I can certainly see where that appreciation of the spirituality and it comes from. But having had a couple of people in my family who were under psychiatric care, the whole emphasis was what drug do you do, and very little on all this other wonderful stuff you're talking about. So are you seeing a change at all in that? And also, what kind of advice would you give to people out here in the regular world who are trying to find people who can make those other connections and go beyond whatever the standard response still seems to be?
Yeah, well, the evidence for change is that the spirituality is being included in the curriculum for a majority of the medical schools, and this JCH mandate is going to require that be included in your initial questions, and hopefully people will have some sense of opening to that. Let's see. In terms of finding someone, sometimes going to a friend who has had a good positive experience, word of mouth helps a lot. Someone who's more trained in psychotherapy. So before you make your appointment, you can ask, I'm looking for someone who can include spiritual issues in psychotherapy. There are some people that actually advertise themselves as Christian psychotherapists or meditators, and you can make those choices too.
I'm a retired hospital chaplain from an Episcopal hospital, retired Army chaplain for 30 years, currently a chaplain with the FBI. In all these settings, I observe that there are, just like there are psychologists and then there are psychologists who Some would be better than others, and MDs, and there are clergy, and then there are clergy. Those of us who are trained not to impose our own denominational bent on people in a chaplaincy setting, indeed have a role in the long list of folks that you left chaplains out of in there. And I was sorry to see that because in a hospital like St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital in Houston, which is one of the major cardiac hospitals in the country, chaplain is included in the spirituality team.
Yeah.
Indeed, has an important role to play. And in dealing with such issues as the near-death experience, there are clergy and there are clergy. I'm shocked at some of the things that some of my fellow clergy say and do with regard to not believing the near-death experience, for example. So I would encourage you to realize the place of well-trained, experienced clergy in your spirituality team.
We actually include them in our team. Our mental health clinic team has the chaplain and a chaplain intern working with us regularly. I'd separated it out because I was going to say about making a specific referral, but I can't add that. And I'm also really glad to know there's chaplains working with the FBI.
There's about 150 of us.
Great.
There are none in the CIA.
Well, then Raymond Moody has his work cut out. Hello.
I'm a psychiatrist, and I was wondering, what do you do when you encounter a patient who say they have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia with multiple past psychiatric hospitalizations for it? And they come to you and they tell you something like, I have been healed by God and I'm not going to take my medicine anymore, or I'm going to stop my medicine and seek healing through prayer and laying on of hands, or in rare cases I'll even see a patient who says, my church told me to stop my medicine, that they laid on hands and healed me. My minister says, don't take the medicine anymore. And I might try to tell them like God works through the medicines, the doctor, or when you talk to a minister or another minister, but sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I was wondering what your approach would be.
I do believe bipolar disorder is a real illness, and but not to do either or. I mean, not to say, with whatever someone's illness is, there are always spiritual issues. We encourage them to get support. A lot of times people will come in and say, get off medicines, and I'll say, well, let's look at what the risk factors are. How many hospitalizations? How many episodes have you had? And I'm saying that is a highly risky thing to do, and I'm not comfortable with that if it's been a severe illness. If there's other times they come in and say, I stopped my medicines, and we'll say, well, I'll continue to monitor you off your medicines. What do you want to use the time to talk about? But so they might do an experiment about it but end up back in the hospital. And so I warn them of the risks.
Thank you very much.